Now, what we're called to do by the syllabus is to understand the cardiac cycle and EKG interpretation. That is what I'm going to be doing now. Alright, so let's have a look at this now. Cardiac terminology, there are some things that we need to know. Systole, right? Systole speaks to contraction. So it's a phase of the cardiac cycle during which the heart muscles contract. And diastole is a phase where they relax. Alright? So when the heart contracts, it's usually pumping blood out. When it goes through diastole and relaxes, it's usually having some of the chambers being filled. Alright? Cardiac output. Cardiac output is a volume of blood that is pumped out by the heart per minute. It is a critical measure of cardiovascular health and is calculated using this formula. So cardiac output is the heart rate times stroke volume. Alright, so it's heart rate times the stroke volume. So the number of heartbeats per minute is the heart rate, and stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle. Right? So since we look at this, right? So stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle, right? How do we calculate stroke volume? Right? The stroke volume is the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. Right? The end diastolic volume is the volume of blood that left the left ventricle at the end of diastole just before the heart contracts. And then the end systolic volume is the volume of blood remaining in the left ventricle. That's how we get the stroke volume, and we use the stroke volume to calculate cardiac output. Right? This is one component of calculating cardiac output. The other component is the heart rate. This is the number of heartbeats per minute. Beats per minute, BPM, is the unit, right? It varies with age, physical condition, level of activity, right? So adults usually have 60 to 100 beats per minute. Children, right? Newborns usually have 70 to 190. Infants 80 to 160. These different amounts, right? So different heartbeats for different things. How do we calculate the average heart rates, right? We take the sum of all heart rates that we calculate and divide them by the number of measurements. So the measure of heart rate multiple times. So we'll measure it multiple times, right? So we can do it. I think you guys did the a module 3 lab about this, right? How you measure heart rate by generally the pulse rate generally on the arm and using the different devices to measure heart rate. So the sum of heart rates is added up all the measured heart rates, right? And you count the amount of numbers of the measurements taken, and then you do some division and you get the average heart rate, right? When we do that now, we can put it to the cardiac output. So we must know stroke volume, we must know heart rate, and we must know to calculate stroke volume, heart rate, and cardiac output. Alright? That should be lovely. Alright? What is pulse? Go ahead.
So what is the calculations for the stroke rate?
For stroke volume?
Yes, stroke
Okay.
volume.
So the end diastolic volume, right? Minus the end systolic volume.
Thank you very much.
Basically, at the end of contraction, right? At the end of diastole, we're gonna have some blood still remaining in the ventricle. So that's why we'll minus that blood that was still remaining to know how much blood left. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Lovely. Right? So we have that, and that's how we get cardiac output. Heart rate times stroke volume. Stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. Heart rate is the number of all heart rates divided by the number of measurements that you took. Right, so now let's talk about what is happening. We start with mid to late ventricular diastole. So the blood enters the heart via the pulmonary veins and venae cavae, right? So whether it be superior or inferior vena cava, and we also have the coronary sinus, right? So we have those three things, right? As blood enters the atria from the pulmonary veins and the superior and inferior vena cava, as well as the atrial sinus, the atrioventricular valves are open, right? And about 70 to 80% of the blood flowing, right, flowing from the atria passively, right, to the ventricles via gravity. So this is the first part of our cardiac cycle. We have blood now coming into the atria, right? 70 to 80% of the blood entering the atrial would now flow passively into the ventricles, right, via gravity. Atrial pressure is less than ventricular pressure. Atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. Remember that liquids move from higher pressure to lower pressure. Mass flow hypothesis, remember that one? Same principle here. Moving from higher pressure to lower pressure. Alright? So blood is filling the ventricles. Right? The late phase now, at this point in time, the sinoatrial node fires and causes the atrial contraction, and the remaining percentage of blood travels into the ventricles via increased atrial pressure. And this is pronounced as a P wave. So let's look at what's happening now. Right? So we're looking at mid to late. I'm going to mark up this entire page, right? So the mid to late ventricular diastole, right? So we have blood now coming in from the pulmonary veins, right? So the pulmonary veins, and this will travel into our atrium, this atrium right here, right? And we have blood coming now from the vena cava into this atrium. So the atrium have no blood coming in, right? They will passively flow down. Blood will passively flow down due to gravity. 70 to 80%. Why did it look so? Oh my god. Watch embarrassment. Alright, so 80%, right? 70 to 80% of the blood will flow down, right? Via gravity, right? So we have that there, right? So the pressure, so we have that there. So it's regular. The valves are open. The atrioventricular valves are open, right? So notice that these valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid, are open. Notice that these valves are closed. The semilunar valves are closed. So blood will continue to now fill up here now. So we see blood rushing in now, right? Hoping everybody can follow, right? In the late phase now, we're gonna have the SA node firing, causing the contraction of the atria. The atria now squeeze, right? Pushing out the remainder of the blood, right? For the most part. And the signal now goes to the sinoatrial node fires it, and now it goes to the atrioventricular node, right? And there's a delay to wait until sufficient blood leaves the atrium. Alright? Following so far, guys?
Yes, sir.
Lovely. Moving on. This is shown as the P wave. The P wave represents a depolarization of the atria, right, in response to the signaling from the sinoatrial node. Alright? So atrial filling, we're filling the atria, and it goes down by gravity. 70 to 80% of it will go into the ventricle. Lovely. Alright? So where are we talking about now? Here we're talking about. Here we're talking about. That is not what we're talking about. Where we're talking about. Is it there? Is it closer to the beginning? Is it closer to the origin? P wave, right? So this is what we're talking about. It's right here with it. Alright? Oh, the pressure is rising there. So the atrial pressure will be greater than the ventricular pressure, right? And since the atrial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure, that's why we're gonna have the liquid moving from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. The atrial pressure is greater than the ventricular pressure. That is what's happening here. Let's see it here. See there now. So the difference between the lines, the orange line and the green line, it is slightly higher than ventricular pressure. See it there? Right? And then after a while now, the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves will close. We're gonna look at that now. And this is what we call isovolumetric systole. We're gonna look at it now. The myocardium depolarizes and causes the ventricles to contract. Right? The blood level rises in the ventricles towards the pulmonary and the aortic sublunary valves, right? And at this point, the aortic, it says arctic pressure, my bad. The aortic pressure, rather, right, is around 80 millimeters of mercury, and the pressure of the pulmonary trunk is around 7 to 10 millimeters of mercury. Right? This represents this represents that the ventricular pressure is still less than the atrial pressure, the arterial pressure rather. Right? The arterial pressure. Arterial pressure speaks to the pressure in the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. So the pressure in the atria falls towards as low as 0 to around 10 millimeters of mercury, causing the edge of the ventricular, right, valves to slam shut, right, causing them to slam shut as blood in the ventricles rises towards the valves that are right. So we're gonna have that, right. This is displayed as lump sound, right, the first heart sound. Let's look at what's happening, right. Remember, we have blood rising, right? So blood is in here, right? What's happening now, is that we're gonna have the depolarization of the ventricles. They will now squeeze, causing blood to rise and continue to rise. This is isovolumetric systole, so they rise like this, right? Once they rise to a certain point, the pressure of the ventricles will surpass that of the pressure of the atria, causing these valves to slam shut. So these valves will now slam shut. The bicuspid and the mitral valve will slam shut, right? And the blood continues to rise as the ventricles contract. Following? So the blood is rising in the heart as the ventricles start to squeeze. Alright? So looking at that. So the atrial pressure, right? The atrial pressure is around 0 to around 7 millimeters of mercury, right? And the ventricular pressure is higher than the atrial pressure. Doesn't that mean that blood should be flowing into the atria? That's a question. If the ventricular pressure is higher than the atrial pressure, doesn't that mean that blood should be flowing from the high ventricular pressure to the low atrial pressure, right?
Yes, sir.
But why doesn't it do that?
Is it because of the valve?
Lovely, because of the valves. The valves prevent the backflow of blood. And when the atrioventricular valve slams shut, you hear the lub sound, our first heart sound. The slamming of those valves shut after we have the contraction of our ventricles. Lovely. Alright? That is the end of this step. We have 2 more stages to go. Alright? We have mid to late ventricular systole, or called ventricular ejection. Right? Now the ventricular pressure continues to rise to around 120 milliliters of mercury in the left and 24 to 27 in the right. Because we know that the left ventricle will have more pressure because it's more dense. The myocardium is much larger, squeezing on the blood at a much higher pressure, right, than the right. So the left ventricle will be around 120 milliliters of mercury, while the right will be around, let's say, 25 millimeters of mercury, right? While the arterioventricular valves are still closed. Now, the ventricular pressure has become greater than the arterial pressure, causing the seminal valves to both, right, both pulmonary and aortic, to open, causing blood to rush out of the ventricles into the coronary, pulmonary, and systemic circuits, right? Now it is important to note that at this stage, this is a stage. I did a voice recording to write the slide. I didn't use my I just talked and the slide wrote itself. So it should be stage, right? Then know that this stage ventricular valves are still closed when ventricular pressure is now higher than atrial pressure. So to prevent the black flow, right? So what's happening here now? These valves are closed, yes? These valves are closed. While blood has reached all the way up here, the pressure in the aorta is around 80 millimeters of mercury. Alright? The pressure in the pulmonary trunk is around what? Around 20, let's say 25 millimeters of mercury. Right? The ventricular pressure, however, now, right? Let's look at this. No, that's not 25. It should be around, let's start around 10 to 15. Sorry about that, 10 to 15. right? So that's around 10 to 15 in the pulmonary trunk. It's not a lot, right? So what's happening now? The left ventricle, the blood in the left ventricle goes to the aorta, right? Blood in the left ventricle goes to the aorta, yes?
Yes, sir.
All right. The pressure in the left ventricle is 120 millimeters of mercury. Blood flows from high pressure to low pressure. So that's how the blood now goes into the aorta. For the right ventricle now, this is around 25 millimeters of mercury. From high pressure to low pressure, that's how it flows into the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. So notice now that semilunar valves will now open, the aortic valve and the pulmonary valves will now open, causing blood to now rush outside of the heart. This is ventricular ejection. Alright? That is the end of this stage. Ready to move on? Any questions? This is the QRS peak, by the way. The QRS peak. This is this peak here. The QRS peak complex represents the depolarization of the ventricles and ventricular contraction, which we have just been describing, right? Triggered by the signals of the atrioventricular node. Alright? Looking at that. Everybody is fine so far? Alright. So what we just described was this, right? So the ventricular filling continued to such a high extent until it surpassed, look at here, look at when it surpassed our aortic pressure, right? And then that is when the valves open. The valves always open when there's a switch in pressures, right? Between which one is greater and which one is smaller, right? So when ventricular pressure now surpasses the aortic pressure, the semilunar valves open and cause the blood to flow, right? And then you know that after a while now, the blood would have been leaving the ventricles, see where it surpasses it now, and now the valves close. Let's talk about it. Before we go there, we're talking about arterial elasticity. It is important to keep in mind that arteries are elastic in nature, so they can overcome the high pressure at which the ventricles push the blood. So the aorta, under immense pressure from ventricular ejection, will stretch and then recoil. So let's call this the aorta, right? Blood is coming up. What it will do is stretch, right? When blood is being pushed against it, and then recoil the blood down. But blood can also recoil this way, don't it? If it's going to be recoiling, it can recoil in both ways, right?
Yeah, yes, sir, yes, sir.
Alright. So what will happen now? When the blood goes down here now into the rest of the systemic circuit, right, that's fine. But if it goes towards the heart now, the semilunar valves are closed. So the blood rushing towards the semilunar valve, that is where we get the dub sound. We're gonna talk about it. That's where we get the dub sound. When they lock close and now it pushes blood and now hits the valves. And I talk about the closing of those valves, where the valves close shut because of the recoil and create the second heart sound, the dub sound. Alright? Isovolumetric diastole now, the relaxation of the heart now. With blood now flowing, right? With blood now flowing throughout the different circuits, right? The arterial pressure is now much greater than the ventricular pressure, since the majority of the blood has not been released. Well, since the majority of the blood has been released, rather, right? So the atrial pressure is still greater than the ventricular pressure, right? The arterial ventricular pressure, or the valves rather, are still closed, and this is represented by the T wave. So let's look at what's happening now, right? The blood is now ejected throughout the two main parts. Hold on. Did I label this as the pulmonary trunk in the last slide? What rubbish? This is the pulmonary trunk. Oh my.
I was looking at it, you know.
Yeah, okay. I'm actually deeply disturbed by that. I apologize. I immensely apologize. I'm getting too old for this, I fear. Alright, let's go. So let's look at this now. Right? So the blood is gonna be rushing throughout these two areas, right? Keeping all well that yeah. So it's gonna be rushing out through those areas, and then the sublunar valves will now shut as arterial pressure will be higher than ventricular pressure. Be reminded that not all blood leaves the heart, no, some is still left back. Tiny amount, right? Tiny amount, yes? So we have that. You see all the blood that just came out? That is a stroke volume. Right? That is a part of the stroke volume, right? So all the blood that just came out in one heartbeat is a stroke volume. Minusing the blood left here. And cardiac output now would be the amount of heartbeats times the stroke volume of the heart. Right? Hopefully that makes sense. So this is shown as a T wave now. Right? T wave represents a repolarization of the ventricles within the ventricular relaxation now. And the completion of a standard heartbeat. We are now done. Right? Between these periods of electrical activity are intervals allowing blood to flow around the heart, the PR interval and the ST interval. Right? So we have that now. Okay? So here now we're looking at this part of the graph now until we reach another contraction. Right? So remember this closing of these valves, the atrioventricular valves is the lobe. The closing of the seminal valves is the dub. Right? We also have a little tiny, secondary kind of sound-ish when the recoil happens. Right? If it gets too much, it can develop into a heart murmur and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, that is generally it. So it's the arterial blood pressure, diastolic and the systolic pressure there. And we have the lead 2 voltage, right? This is how we get the voltage of the heart and produce this graph. Go ahead.
So, sir, to remember, we can basically just say there are four movements, in a
4
sense.
general movements, yes. 4 motions. Like a symphony, there are 4 specific movements that this beautiful organ does, right? So we're gonna categorize them late to mid ventricular diastole, right? Isovolumetric systole, right? Mid to late ventricular systole, and then we just have isovolumetric diastole, right? That's how I categorize them, right? Issues with cardiac rhythm now. You have normal sinus rhythm, right? You have arrhythmias when the actual beat, the complex itself is normal. The PQRST complex is normal, but it's irregular. If it is too fast, it is bradycardia. Well, if it's evenly spaced, right? It's evenly spaced and it's actually going to be a little bit too slow, rather, that is bradycardia. If it is evenly spaced and really fast, it is tachycardia, right? You have atrial fibrillation when the baseline is irregular. So notice how the baseline is completely irregular in fibrillation, right? And ventricular fibrillation. These are things that we use a defibrillator, the shocking instrument that you see in Grey's Anatomy and House and everything, right? That's what they use to fix those things. Bradycardia and tachycardia can be resolved using different types of drugs and different types of instruments, right? In order to handle the heart rate, right? What those things tend to do is now affect the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system in order to get the heart back on track, right? If those things don't work, then there's most certainly an issue with the AV node, not the AV node, the SA node. Therefore, you're going to need to have a pacemaker instilled within your heart if the SA node is not functioning correctly. Alright? So that is it. Any questions or any concerns?